I'm going to ask if you can shut your cameras off while we are doing the recording and presentation part of this meeting, just so I don't know that it enhances bandwidth, because really that's on your own end, but maybe it might help. So let's go ahead and do that. Go ahead, shut your videos off. And then when you ask questions at the end, it will be absolutely wonderful if you turn your video on so that Mike can see you, know who you are, and know that you're a real live human being asking him a question, as we're all in this virtual world. I am just going to pull up a few things on my end. Give me 1 second to do that. Again, I tell you what, these nonstop meetings, I'm not sure that I like being in meetings all day long. Okay, we have it. Ready. All right. I'm assuming that everybody's familiar with Teams, but in case folks aren't, I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick overview as we welcome you to our first Prairie Reconstruction Initiative webinar. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see what I'm doing. And again, just a quick reminder to go ahead and turn your videos off, so that way we can just maintain good bandwidth for everyone. So during the presentation, if you need to ask a question and you're just afraid that you'll forget it, please type it into the chat. The chat bubble is right here at the top of your screen. If you ever want to see who all the participants are in this meeting, you can click these little people huddled together and you can see everyone who's here. If you have a question and you feel more comfortable giving voice to that question, please feel free to use these happy little emojis, use the hand emoji. If you really like something that Mike's saying in his presentation and you think it's awesome, or if you're like shocked at how cool grassland birds are, feel free to use any one of these just to enhance our interactions. If you click these 3 little dots here, you will notice some additional tools that might be helpful. So one of the things that's on here is you can turn on live captions. So if you happen to need captions, or Mike's mumbling and you just want to know what he's saying, you can go ahead and click that here. Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm just making up words. I haven't had lunch. This is what you get. So you can turn on live captions here and they'll just populate on your screen. And sometimes that makes it easier to follow along. While Mike's presenting, if you need to, what's the word I'm going to use, bigger his presentation because you can't see it, you can click full screen here and it will make it as big as possible. And Mike is also a Teams expert, so he knows how to do all of these things. Yes, Mike, I'm just making up all kinds of words. There's a lot of peanut gallerying over here from Mike. So I'm going to do a quick introduction about what the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is, and then I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Mike Worland, to kick off our webinar series. So I'm going to share my screen again. I have multiple screens. I didn't say, that sounded kind of braggy. I didn't mean it braggy, like, I got 2 screens. How many screens do you have? I didn't mean it like that, just so you know. I more meant... Okay, I can't click anything and I don't know why. Oh, happy Wednesday. So I'm just going to do it like this until it lets me, oh, look, it lets me do things. How nice. Woohoo! Okay, so you are sitting in a Prairie Reconstruction Initiative webinar. In case you have always wondered, what is that? And that sounds fun. And I want another acronym to say. Welcome to the group. You can join anytime. Jamie is going to put in the link into the chat so that you can join and add your email to our listserv so that you can get fabulous Prairie Reconstruction updates about all the great work our group is doing. So essentially what we are is we're just a collaborative of people who are interested in Prairie Reconstruction and we want to figure out how to do it better. And so our whole purpose is to build this community of practice where we're networking with each other, we're sharing ideas, we're going to the field together. Can you even imagine such a world? where we're learning different techniques and trying to uncover and overcome all of the uncertainty that we face as we try to get better at doing prairie reconstruction and understanding what doing better means. So in our sense, doing better means that we want our reconstructions to be biologically diverse, ecologically functional. We want them to resist invasion by non-native plants, and we also want them to be cost effective to manage. It's the holy grail of restoration. So we currently have a database that will be coming live soon, hopefully this field season. We also have monitoring protocols to standardize our data collection in prairie restorations. We host great webinars like this, and then we have field days that we put together so that we can keep that community of practice strong. So that's who we are. And now I'm going to, without further ado, because I'm just cutting into his time, I'm going to introduce our fabulous guest speaker. He's already got his camera on. It's like he's a professional doing this. So Mike Worland happens to be my wonderful colleague, but he's also a Nongame wildlife specialist with the Minnesota DNR. He covers southern Minnesota, which it's 32 counties in southern Minnesota. So if you take off everything, if you took the state, cut it in half, and took off everything but the boot, that's pretty much the area that he covers. He's based out of Secaucus State Park, although today he's at his home office in Northfield, Minnesota. So in addition to being a grassland bird expert, Mike is also the co-host of the very popular Prairie podcast. And he just happens to be an all-around decent fella. I can't think of a better person to kick off our webinar series because he's not only knowledgeable, he's fun, he's passionate, and he has a lot of great prairie information to share with all of you. So he's been here for 6 years, but he worked, don't hold it against him, he worked for Wisconsin DNR for 14 years, and we are benefiting from that vast experience that he brings to the agency. Mike, take it away, buddy.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, I'll get you a beer sometime. I can always say that because I don't think you drink beer, do you? So it's always a safe.
Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded.
A beverage. There you
Carry
go. On. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good morning. You know what? It's not morning. I'm still drinking coffee, so I think that makes it feel like morning, but good afternoon. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about monitoring effectiveness of restorations, specifically how they impact grassland bird communities. And I know there's a diverse group here. You know, the PRI, I think, is largely interested in plants. Much of what I say here today, I think, you know, some of it is I'm talking about some specific results to grassland birds, but much of what I'm talking about as far as design and so forth, I think could certainly be extrapolated to other components of the prairie ecosystem. So today I'm going to talk, first of all, I need to share my screen, don't I?
That would be wonderful. Also, this group, Mike, is not just about plants. We like all things that are part of prairies.
I know that.
I know an ecosystem. Don't make me sing the Circle of Life. I'll do it.
Okay, do not. It's not coming up yet, is it?
Are you seeing it, Megan? You're good to go. I sure am seeing it.
Oh, cool. Very good. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about monitoring effectiveness of restorations and how that impacts grassland birds. I'm going to break it down into 3 basic parts. Number 1 is just kind of a general background, a very basic background. Number 2, I'm going to talk about 2 different projects I worked on recently targeted on grassland birds and restorations. That part is going to be focused on design issues for monitoring effectiveness. And then third, I'm going to combine the results of those 2 different projects to talk about some pretty basic preliminary results for how grassland bird communities use restorations. Okay, so those 3 basic parts. My slide isn't advancing here. That's a problem. There we go. So all of this work is really targeted. It's, you know what, it's targeted at 2 plans. This slide is missing. I put the wrong slide here. There's 2 plans. The Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan is, of course, a very large driver of what we're doing here. Also, the Minnesota Wildlife Action Plan. Those 2 plans combined really direct most of my work, much of my work at least. Also, Lisa Gelvin and Veer, she's my Nongame counterpart in the southern region. All the other Nongame specialists throughout the state that work in the prairie region. Those 2 plans are important for us. The Prairie Conservation Plan specifically emphasizes, sorry, I'm skipping around here, specifically emphasizes stable or increasing grassland bird populations as a key issue to monitor, to evaluate effectiveness of the plan. Also, the plan specifically mentions restorations. So it's one of 3 conservation actions emphasized by the plan: restorations, enhancements, and protection. Restorations is a key one. It also specifically mentions assessing the effects of restorations. So this work really is tightly keyed into the Minnesota Prairie Plan. So yeah, just a little more background. I imagine most people on the call are fully aware of all this, but while I have a captive audience, I like to really reinforce this message that many of our species associated with prairies are crashing. Their populations are declining at steep rates. So this graph here shows 2 different monitoring efforts. The black bars indicate results from our SPICE monitoring effort. This is a work under the DNR. SPICE stands for Sustaining Prairies in a Changing Environment. And so we have 14 years of bird data, and these are solely in protected, relatively high quality remnant prairies. And these are the population trends. The black bars indicate the population trends. The dot is the actual estimate, and then the bar indicates the 95% confidence interval around that estimate. And then the light gray bars indicate breeding bird survey trends. So these are trends throughout the state. No, I'm sorry. We did isolate trends in the prairie region in the state. Yeah, so it's all kinds of habitat, right? These are just road transects. They aren't in any particular habitat like our work is. But you see here, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarities between these 2 trends. I'll just focus on a couple here to highlight. These values, this is percent change per year, and sometimes people have a little trouble wrapping their brains around what these figures mean. So just give you an idea, for example, upland sandpiper, in our protected remnant prairies in Minnesota, we're estimating a 7% decline per year, as you can see there, with a pretty large confidence interval. And I'm sorry for these abbreviations. I should have changed those. UPSA is upland sandpiper. And so 7% change per year doesn't necessarily sound like a whole lot, but it is. It's a lot. To give you an idea of what that means, a 7% change per year, decline per year, means that half of the population is gone in a 10-year period. So that's the rate that we are estimating for upland sandpipers now, and you can see a few other species that are close to that same level. A pretty scary one here is LeConte's sparrow. You can see that its rate of change is very high, or its rate of decline is very high. So yeah, some definite things to be. This is a definite reason why we care about grassland birds, and why we're studying effects of restorations for them. Just a little more context, since I mentioned restorations. Restoration impacts for grassland birds is kind of interesting to think about, because grassland birds, we don't expect them to be tightly linked to floral resources. For example, pollinators. We would expect to see some strong responses to the floral composition of a restoration. For grassland birds, we don't expect to see that. But the thing about the real benefit that restorations can give us for grassland birds is what they do at the landscape level. They really connect habitat, and we've, prior research on grassland birds has really highlighted the importance of habitat at a landscape level. So kind of restorations can provide kind of a double benefit for grassland birds. Grassland birds will use the restoration itself, but then also in adjacent sites, other sites within that same landscape could benefit from that restoration happening. Yeah, so this is a trend for the western meadowlark, and this kind of graph is a little more dramatic, highlighting what's happening to some of these populations. So this is what like a 5% change, 5% trend looks like in this graph. So it's pretty dramatic. When we're talking about effectiveness monitoring, there's kind of two different ways to think about it. One is that you can just go out and do what the Breeding Bird Survey is doing here and measure trends. And that can be, and often is, the way people do effectiveness monitoring. The issue with that, of course, is that doesn't necessarily indicate the effect that you are having. And when I say you, I mean, in this case, the prairie plan, or a project, or a restoration activity, or any kind of management activity. If you really want to understand the effect that thing is having on a population, just going out and measuring a trend doesn't necessarily provide that, right? So in the projects I'm presenting today, the teams that were involved in these, we've decided early on that we really did want to try to isolate the effects of restorations, and the effect of the Minnesota Prairie Plan. So I'll now get into the designs of these two projects. The first one I want to talk about is a pilot project we initiated back in 2018. It had one field season, 2018. So this was really a pilot project to help us evaluate the effectiveness of the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. And we focused on restorations as the one enhancement activity that we were interested in. So this slide here shows the study areas for that project. This shows the basic design. You can see the red circles there. There are 16 landscapes within which we surveyed. These were 2 kilometer radius or diameter. I can't remember. I believe 2 kilometer radius landscapes. This is a close up. Nope, 2 kilometer diameter. No, it's miles. Never mind. Yeah, they were 2 kilometer radius landscapes. You can see the pink polygons in the center of that landscape. That is the restoration. All of these landscapes were centered on restorations, and then the transects you see there. That's the transects along which we surveyed. But just some quick basic results from that project to highlight here. You can see, and so this is just focusing on grassland specialists, birds whose primary habitat is grass. They need grass for some component of their life cycle, and usually it's what they nest in. So we had a total of over 5,000 birds. I forget how many species, but you can see them right there. A couple of things to highlight here. Number one, savanna sparrow. This has traditionally been a pretty common species that's been tightly linked to all sorts of grasslands. You go out in the pasture. In the past, there's been a pretty good chance you're going to hear a savanna sparrow if you're in western Minnesota. We found some pretty low numbers here. A total of 66 observations over hundreds of point counts, and so that's one thing I wanted to point out. Also, western meadowlark. We had some moderate numbers in the Cottonwood River and Lac Parle landscapes. We had 0 in the Glacial Lakes landscape, just to remind you of where that was. Yeah, Glacial Lakes. It's the northernmost that you're seeing here that overlaps Glenwood. We had 0 observations in that landscape for western meadowlarks. Yeah, I think that's, Henslow sparrows also state endangered species, state threatened species. You can see we had fair numbers for it in 2 of the landscapes. Also quite interesting for LeConte sparrow. This was an unusual year, 2018. If you remember this year, it was a major flood year. Some of the worst flooding in the southwest part of the state that we've seen in decades. And LeConte sparrow responded to that they're associated with wetter prairies. So normally that was an unusually high year for LeConte sparrow. Dustin, I just caught your comment. I'm just going to go ahead and answer that. This particular work was not associated. This was not a pre and post kind of experiment. This was a pilot to help us design that kind of experiment. And so these were not before restoration. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. The majority of these surveys were just in grasslands, CRP land, pasture, hay, old restorations. That was the majority of this work. Some of it, a small percentage of it, I think less than a quarter, was in restorations. And actually, I think I will be showing some of those numbers, Dustin, so we can see how these birds use restorations in these data. So one thing I want to emphasize, a big benefit that is an indicative of the benefit of a power, or I'm sorry, a big benefit of doing a pilot study is a power analysis. So I just kind of want to take you through that quickly to help you understand why we did this pilot and why I think pilots in general are good things to do for all sorts of projects, but in particular effectiveness monitoring. So for this work, what this graph is showing us, just kind of walk you through this. It's telling us that we are likely, if we duplicated this survey effort in another year, we would be likely to be able to detect a 4.7% change in the population of grassland birds. So this is all grassland birds combined across species. If we were interested in that metric, we'd be able to detect a 4.7% change in the population with this study design. That's what that graph is telling us. So this graph is showing us how different sample sizes would impact that power. Here's our current sample size, 440 transects. We're able to detect a 4.7% change in the population. If we lowered that sample size to, forget the number I used here, but this is something like 380 or 360 transects, we'd be able to then detect a 5.2% change in the population. So that number goes up, but our power actually goes down. We're detecting, we have to have a more dramatic change in the population before we would be able to detect it. So one thing this graph is showing us is that you can see these lines kind of bunching up here at the left side. And this is showing us that as we increase our sample size now, we're getting less bang for our buck. Our ability to detect change is not going up by much as we add transects. This is kind of another way to look at it. This shows the number of transects in the sample down here on the x-axis, and this shows the total density, birds per hectare, on the y-axis. So this shows us how that estimate, the 95% confidence interval around that estimate, changes as we change the number of transects. So our current estimate over here at the far right, our current survey effort at the far right, you can see you could really shrink that survey effort down to like 250 transects before you start noticing a noticeable change in that confidence interval. So this is showing us that for this particular metric, all grassland birds combined, we really were oversampling. And one thing that it encourages You know, if we were to redo this sampling effort for grassland birds, you know, instead of adding more transects, we would think about adding other things to reduce the noise in our data. So we didn't account for habitat characteristics in these restorations. We all know that restorations can vary quite a lot from the you know, how they're seeded, when they're seeded, the species that go into the seed mix. All these things have important effects on restorations, and we didn't account for any of that. And so I think if we were to redo this, we would start trying to account for the species composition of these restorations, some of the structural differences in the vegetation in these restorations, and that would really help us narrow these confidence intervals. So a couple of design ideas that came out of that project. Again, this is not what we did. These are recommendations for evaluating effectiveness of the prairie plan. And one would be to put transects in the prairie plan cores. So that's where these blue polygons are. And then put transects in the agricultural matrix and compare population trends between those two areas. So the strength of this design is that it's large scale. And that's something we wanted when we were talking about evaluating the prairie plan. We wanted it to be large scale. We wanted to talk about how the prairie plan was impacting populations throughout the prairie region. The weakness of it is that it really doesn't help us isolate the effect of restorations. You know, we can show a slower decline, say, or maybe even an increase in populations in the cores, but this doesn't help us necessarily say that restorations or any other prairie plan actions are responsible for it. So that's the drawback of this approach. There are a few different ways of sampling and time using that approach. I think in the interest of our time, I'm not going to go into those details. Yeah, the economical version for that particular approach is to drop all the surveys in the agricultural matrix and just survey in the cores. And then you would compare results to existing efforts that are estimating bird trends, like the breeding bird survey and like SPICE. Challenges with that, of course, because you're talking about using two different data sets. There's always issues with that. The other approach that we recommended from the pilot is BACI. BACI stands for Before After Control Impact. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the strength of this is that this should allow you to isolate the effect of that restoration. And probably the challenge or the drawback of it is that mainly we're talking about smaller scales. We're talking about looking at effects at a small landscape or a site scale, and we're not really doing anything across the region. That feeds right into the second project I wanted to talk about. We're doing a before-after control impact study in southwest Minnesota. And so just to kind of introduce you to the basic idea behind a before-after control impact, BACI, I'll try to say BACI from now on, study, is that you're looking at the change that occurs between pre and post treatment, pre and post restoration. And then the real key for this design is to have control sites. The control sites are really what allow you to account for these other things that you're not necessarily interested in. So for example, you know, last year we had this drought year that was bound to impact bird populations. It'll probably impact bird populations for the next year or two because of its impact on nesting success. And so having that control site where that drought is infecting the assumption here is that the drought is affecting the control sites and the treated sites equally. And the control sites then will help you account for that effect and help you isolate the effect of that restoration. This is the study area for that BACI project. it may not come out very well, but you can see that gold orangish line is the Prairie Coteau Conservation Focus Area. So this is an area that was designated under the Minnesota Wildlife Action Plan, and it's where Lisa and I, Nongame staff, and our partners are focusing most of our conservation work in the southern region. And then you can see the stars there. Those are our sites where we sampled, where we surveyed for birds. So this is kind of an example of a site and how we set it up. The crosshatched area there, we did pre-treatment surveys there. That's to be planted. I don't think it was planted in 21, but it's going to get planted soon. The 2020 restoration was just planted, so we have pre and post-treatment data there. And then one thing that's we wanted to do for this particular project was look at how these restorations impact adjacent sites. So for birds, we selected habitat 100 to 400 meters away, or I believe 100 to 500 meters away from the restoration. We didn't want it right next to the restoration because we wanted it to be a little bit separate, isolated, so, for an independent bird community. But here you can see the landscape buffer over here to the east. That's where we're sampling birds in the adjacent site. We have pre and post data for those as well, to help us evaluate the effect of the restorations on those adjacent sites. Yeah, so now I'll get into some results. So here I'm going to present restoration results for both of these projects. For the pilot, probably the most rigorous results we have is what I'm showing here. These were models. Jason Brueggemann, our statistician, did this modeling. Restoration, whether the transect was in a restoration or not, was included as a factor variable in these models. And so for killdeer, clay-colored sparrow, and then all grassland birds combined, they showed positive responses to a transect being in a restoration. And so you might interpret that to say that they had higher densities in restorations than they did in non-restorations. So this all grassland birds combined, it's kind of a tricky metric. Clay-colored sparrows were our most abundant bird, our most abundant grassland specialist. And so they may be largely driving that response, just to be upfront about it. But one key thing with these results are that we had no grassland specialists that showed a negative response to restorations. So it was either positive or neutral. So that was an encouraging result for restoration impacts. This is a little bit more of a general, basic kind of examination of the data. On the y-axis, that's a ratio of the birds numbers in restorations compared to non-restorations. So, for example, for LeConte sparrows, you can see basically they were over twice as common in restorations as they were in non-restorations. So for some of these birds, these are very encouraging results. For LeConte sparrow, if you recall from the prior graph, their populations appear to be declining quite steeply, and this is showing us that they were using restorations quite a bit, possibly more than they were using non-restorations. The tricky thing with them, of course, is that this was basically an eruptive year for them because of the wet conditions, and they're normally not that abundant in the southwest part of the state. But you can see some encouraging results for dick thistle, grasshopper sparrow, and several other species there. At a minimum, I think it's safe to say, based on these data, they were using restorations at least as much as they were using non-restorations. A couple of more worrying results: upland sandpiper and marbled godwit. We know those two species are dropping significantly in the state. We don't have a trend for marbled godwits because they're too uncommon, but we've had them drop out of a lot of sites that we've been surveying over the last 14 years. And you can see that they were not using restorations as much as they were using non-restorations. Part of that could be driven by the size of the prairie. We know restorations, of course, tend to be smaller than our remnant prairies. Some of our remnant prairies are big, and that's probably a factor for those two species and some of these others too. So here are some results focused on our Backe monitoring, and so it's at this point it's too soon to give any results for our Backe monitoring as far as pre and post comparisons. But I did look at differences in numbers between restorations, remnant prairie, and grass prairie and grasslands. I included here a pre-treatment category. And one thing about these pre-treated sites, it's a little bit weird because they're quite often either row crop fields or what's the word I'm looking for? Empty fields with nothing in them, essentially, except for some weeds, fallow fields. And so really pretty low quality habitat for many species, in fact, probably unsuitable habitat for many species. The parameter on the y-axis, in this case, it's species richness. So number of grassland specialists occurring. I'll just explain these box plots to you if you're not familiar with them. The X shows the mean. The box there shows the upper and lower quartiles, the 25 and 75% range of the data, and then the so-called whiskers show the rest of the data. So it gives you an idea of the spread of the data as well, which is important, I think. But you can see here for species richness, they're all restorations, remnant prairies, and grasslands are all pretty close. The pre-treated sites dropped way low, as one would expect. As I said, they're mainly fallow fields in this data set. Clay-colored sparrows, if you recall, they had a positive response to restorations in the pilot. Here, it looks like they're all about the same with remnant prairie and with grasslands. Killdeer density, if you recall, killdeer had a positive response to restorations in the pilot, and that is duplicated here. The means aren't terribly different, but you can see some pretty high densities in restorations in these data. Grasshopper sparrows are all about the same, except for the pre-treatment. Dick thistles are showing some signs of being higher density in restorations. Though again, if you see the X's there, those are the means, and those are all fairly similar. This is interesting for western meadowlarks. They're showing some pretty high numbers in the pre-treatment sites. So that's interesting. Again, these are mostly fallow fields, and western meadowlarks are quite often sitting on top of fence posts or something, and so these may be like fence posts around these sites where the surveyors were picking them up. And it's also gets it's part of the challenge with looking at how these restorations are impacting these birds, because these birds have large home ranges. They can't have large home ranges that go outside of these restorations, and I think that's the case here with western meadowlarks. So some basic take-home points. Backe designs can work well for effectiveness monitoring. It's not to say there's not challenges. There are some challenges I don't think I really mentioned. I can touch on them quickly. Number one, again, is this idea of a pre-treatment site. Depending on what species you're talking about, it can really be completely unsuitable habitat. Quite often for our pollinators, the pre-treatment sites are really unsuitable habitat. So the question of, how does that restoration impact the community in that habitat? In some respects, it can be kind of a meaningless question sometimes, because you're comparing suitable habitat to unsuitable habitat. So we might have to shift our question a little bit for some of these species and really look at how the community changes through time for the restoration. That can be a very interesting question, as we know, because that restoration changes quite a bit early on, especially. There are possible larger scale designs to get at effectiveness, but the drawback with them is that you're not going to be able to isolate effects of restorations as much as you might want to. Too early to say for sure how these restorations are impacting bird communities when looking at a pre and post comparison. But overall, we can say that grassland specialists certainly are using them. There's good evidence that the communities are going to be similar between them and remnants. And there's some limited evidence of higher rates of use for some species in restorations. I want to acknowledge partners. This is a pretty big group that was involved with the design of the pilot. And these are our bird surveyors for the pilot. I'll point out a couple of people in particular with the Natural Resources Research Institute. They've become a pretty important partner for these grassland bird surveys, even though they're based way up north. And some Prairie Coteau partners. I didn't mean to make this slide this way, but it's fine. Yeah, the people at the top, both the bird surveyors and the people to the right, have all been important for designing this project. The bird surveyors, of course, helped me gather bird data, and then the managers at the bottom. That's a key point with effectiveness monitoring. The managers need to be really integrated into the process at the ground floor, and if they're not, it'll make effectiveness monitoring much harder. So I appreciate working with those folks. That's all I have. Thank you.
I feel like we should all just give you a big round of applause quick. Look at that. Look
Everybody
at all
can do
those
it while muted. That's fine. Yeah.
I love it so much. So now folks have questions, and so I'm going to do my best to make sure that I go through. I'm seeing them come through. So 1 second, should have made my screen big in the background, but I was talking to the plumber. You know how it goes. Okay. You know what I don't like about Teams, Mike? I'm just going to share with you what I don't like. I don't like that it doesn't show you, it splits your external people and your internal people, so you can't see a full list of people ever at the same time. Okay, Dustin, I know you were second, but somebody was ahead of you, and I certainly can't scroll through the attendee list to see all your hands. It was a person starting with the name M, so if that person wants to give voice to their question, that would be great. And I can't call on you. Maybe you type in the chat if you have a question. Like, you don't have to type your question, just say I have a question, because I can't see all the hands when there's this many people on the call. Okay, Dustin, you go ahead until we figure out who the next person is.
I accidentally raised my hand instead of clapping, but I will ask a question.
Now you have to, yeah.
So how are you collecting veg data for the restorations, and are you collecting any for the surrounding communities that you have transects in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have done PRI, what do you call it? Is it protocol B? The meandering protocol for veg surveys in all these sites. We hired a contractor, Seed to Site, Genevieve Brand, to do those surveys. Yeah, so that's something I need to do, is a basic analysis looking at how those veg data are associated with these bird responses. Yeah, we are collecting those data. Meandering data, that protocol really kind of gets at species composition, not a lot of abundance kind of data, is my understanding of it. But yeah. I know Megan and others have also done protocol A. I'm not sure if it's A and B, but the more intensive protocol, the plot level protocol on some of these sites as well. So we've got multiple veg data sets for some of these sites. It'll be pretty interesting to compare them all.
Any other questions? Feel free to type in the chat and say, I have hard questions for Mike. Can ask things like, where did you get your fancy vest that you're wearing today? What is your favorite grassland bird? Why do you like them so much?
Favorite grassland bird is the marbled godwit.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, my best experience with it was I had my first observation of one. It flew right at me, flew circles around me all the while it was calling, and it was pretty glorious.
Well, did you so Mike, I had to step away for a second. Did you answer Lisa's question when she asked in the chat and you were
No, I
showing
missed
the
it.
chart? So Lisa, can you give voice to your question so that Mike can scroll to that? I know it was when he was showing the chart.
Oh, he answered it, and
yeah.
and I was pretty sure I knew the answer, but I wasn't sure if everyone else did. So just, you know, as a
Perfect.
clarification thing.
Good job clarifying.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Look at all your data and your fancy
Yeah,
charts.
I'm just kind of exploring if there's something else that's worth emphasizing since we have time here.
You do have time, but we also can let people go early too. That's okay too.
Of course.
I just want to make sure everybody, oh, somebody has their hand up. Brad, do you feel comfortable giving voice to your question?
I'm just curious, with such a broad range of species, you know, some of those grassland birds come in early on when the restorations are kind of rank, like yeah, especially when they're more open. I can see like your killdeer or dixasills or something when the things are coming in, and then as those, you know, we get more grassland, depending like meadowlarks or bobolinks, we get more grassland birds in a hayfield than we do in a native prairie. So I'm just wondering how structure seems to be really important. I'm wondering, with such a wide diversity, how can your surveys really relate to restoration versus the stage or structure of your prairie?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah, right now we have not had the funding or time to go out and take structural measurements in these restorations. That would be good. I mean, like I said, we have veg data, but you know, we're not anticipating the veg data, the species composition to be tightly linked to these birds for the most part. Structural data would be different. We haven't been able to collect that. We can infer some things based on the age of the prairie, like you said, you know, early on, you might get some certain species associated with more open vegetation or something like that. And yeah, so I anticipate seeing some patterns based on the age of the restorations. Yeah, but the structure is a good point and something that we ought to try to find the money and time for to take those measurements. Right now, it's very basic, looking at trying to measure the bird response to these restorations and just documenting that. So even if it's kind of general, and even if we're kind of glossing over some of the structural differences, doing a good job of documenting that there are diverse communities comprised of these grassland specialists in these restorations, that is a benefit we're achieving with them. That really is our objective now, is just to investigate that. And again, the extra question of how they're impacting adjacent prairies is, I think, also very worthwhile and something that we don't necessarily have a good fix on, like just how much of a benefit there is to these adjacent prairies. And if there is a good sized benefit there, that's yet more ammunition for us to, if ammunition is the right word, more reason for us to emphasize restorations.
Becky, Marty, would you mind giving voice to your question? And if you do mind, I can certainly read it for you.
I can handle it, Megan. Hey, Mike, thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
Great photos and great work here. My question is, as you well know, I live not in the southern part of the state, but in the northern part of the state. And I'm wondering how applicable you think, based on your experience, this sort of work and analysis, the results, would apply in northern Minnesota. And the same question also applies to the broad general range of prairie types, whether you're talking reconstructed, restored, whatever, but in terms of being dry, mesic, wet, saline.
Well, I'll say that I feel reasonably confident saying that, you know, some of our design lessons that we've acquired from these two studies when it comes to effectiveness monitoring would apply in the Northwest. You know, the vacuum monitoring, the large scale monitoring. I think they would work the same way in the Northwest. The responses of these bird communities to restorations, I think you would want to be careful because that's landscape is significantly different up there.
Mm-hmm.
So ideally,
Okay.
we'd repeat some of this work up there, and you know, the Backy monitoring we're doing now really is tied into that Prairie Coteau conservation focus area. That is the reason
Mm-hmm.
we've selected that study area.
How were you able to fund it?
Well,
Did I miss you saying that?
you didn't. I didn't say.
Oh,
but,
will you say now?
You know, my objective with that monitoring was really to make it not cost much and keep it as internal as possible. Yeah, so these bird surveyors are all internal except for Jessica Gorozo, who was with NRRI. So we did hire her under a small contract. But yeah, these data don't cost a lot to collect. You know, as you know, that's one thing with bird data. You can get a lot of observations in a fairly short period of time. And so either we do it internally or we do it with like these $5,000 contracts. And so it's quite doable for a small amount of money, especially if you can find the internal staff. You know, we've got birders that enjoy going out and collecting data. Birders are under very high demand, especially there's a really short window, June basically. But yeah, the effectiveness monitoring part of this has not cost much at all.
Mike, do you have any sense of,
Thank you,
for the people that were here, the effort level? So like the hours of time spent in the field or days or just some kind of ballpark estimate?
Well, for again, I really have stressed making this sustainable in the long term and not requiring a lot of time amongst people that had very limited time in this window. So for the effectiveness monitoring in the Prairie Coteau, I think our total effort this year was 8-person mornings, roughly 8, 9,
total
10.
like across everyone. Yeah.
Across everyone. So each of 4 people, me, Allison, Darren, and Bob did 2 or maybe 3 mornings. And Jessica, I know she did more than that. She did 2 surveys of each site. We only did 1 survey of each site. And this year I might hire another contractor to help us get at 3 surveys of each site to help us assess how much those multiple surveys benefit these data. But yeah, so pretty low. The pilot was a much more intense effort, and that was, like I said, that was hundreds of point counts, hundreds of transects. We use transects, not point counts. And you know, that was a $70-some thousand study. So that, you know, and $70,000, of course, as people know on this call, in this world, it's not a lot of money when you're talking about doing management. You know, that's not that much money. So it is possible to do a good job of monitoring without huge chunks of cash. It's that especially in the bird world, with other types of with other classes of wildlife, I know it's different and can be more more expensive.
I was just thinking if people wanted to translate that to a contract, I don't know that this is helpful to anyone, but our rate for biological data, or our standard rate, is $96 an hour. And no, I do not mean that that's what we pay Mike. I mean, if we were to contract it out, he's a very expensive scientist. But just if you wanted to multiply 8 person days by $96 per hour to get some sense of, and like Mike said, less than $5,000 contract. Ryan had a question for you, Mike. Ryan, do you feel comfortable giving voice to your question, or would you like me to read it?
Yes, I can go ahead quick. I was just curious if you were aware of any similar research happening in Northwest Iowa. I see that I'm one of the few Iowans on here, but any similar research going on in Prairie Pothole region in Northwest Iowa? And if so, is there any collaboration between Minnesota and Iowa?
I don't know about birds. I really don't. I wouldn't be surprised if there was. We have collaborated with some Iowa folks on a competitive state wildlife grant looking at how pollinators respond to different restoration techniques. And I will have trouble coming up with those names. If Jessica Peterson is on the call, she could put those in the chat. I don't know if she's on or not, but yeah, there is an Iowa effort that we have collaborated with them, looking at pollinators, and similar kinds of questions to this, the response to restorations, and the Iowa effort I know is more experimental in nature. They've got plots where they're doing different restoration techniques to them. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Ryan, if you want to put Jess is not on the chat, so if you wanted to put your email address into the chat, we can get Jess to follow up with who those names are.
Yeah, I can
so
too. It's just,
yeah,
I don't know off the top of my head. I can't remember.
All right, I think we're right at the very, very end. Thanks so much for presenting, Mike. Fabulous job. I always learn whenever you're here. Thanks everybody for being part of this. Just a reminder that we're going to have webinars every Wednesday from 1 to 2 Central Standard Time through February. So we have 2 more webinars to go, basically, because we're quitting early. But it'll be, we hope to see you again. Good luck in all of your restoration endeavors, and don't forget to keep talking to each other.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. And we